I think we're up at a good enough number now, so I'm just going to kick things off and anyone else can come in and join us. So, hello everyone, welcome to the next DETA webinar celebrating some of our best RIAS Special Category Award winners from 2026. The projects were judged by myself. I'm Eilidh Izat, alongside Owen Hopkins, Chris Dyson and Anna Louie. We decided to, in the end, it was tough, but we decided to shortlist 14 projects and award 10 projects with awards, with a further 5 special award winners going to the special categories. So this is the 4th in the In Detail series, and if anyone wants to catch up on other, I suppose, webinars from the last few weeks, they can go on to the YouTube channel. And then we've got the final one coming up next week, which is next Wednesday, and that will be on the Tower Layer Outdoor Pool Pavilion. So again, today's webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube shortly after. So if anyone needs to nip away or want to come back to another time, it will be there just in a couple of hours' time. So this week we are joined by Ian Fraser, who will be giving us an insight into the Canna House project, which was a bit of a challenge to get to, but that's part of the charm. So I can't wait to hear about it. I'll introduce him in a second, but before that, I just want to say that Canna House won one of our regular project awards, but it was also the recipient of the RIAS Velux Architectural Heritage Award. And I'm pleased to say that we've got Richard Williams from Velux here today. So I'll just do a very brief intro and then I'll hand over to Richard. So Richard joined Velux over 32 years ago, and he is currently the Senior Architectural Development Manager. So he can probably answer most of the questions that we have and is busy developing lots of good products for us. So I'll pass it over to Richard, who's going to give you a brief intro into some of what they're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I guess specifically, we have been working with RIAS for some years now. I'm really, really proud to do so as an ongoing sort of sponsor. And it's so important for us because we want to engage in all the projects that everybody's involved in, not just new build, but also the retrofit and refurbishment. And the renovation and refurbishment sector is ever growing. And it's really is one of our important strategies going forward, and we'll continue to do that. It's so important for us because Velux VE for ventilation and Lux through light, daylight and ventilation is really important to all the buildings we have. And it's especially as we are now the indoor generation. And what I mean by that, we spend an alarming 90% of our time in buildings that you're designing, that we're living in, socializing in and working within. And so having a new product, the Heritage product, I should say, that we worked in conjunction with different architects, conservation officers alike for over 6 years. It was so obvious that to support this particular scheme, which obviously we're proud to do and wish to continue to do. So it's just to thank you all very much indeed for that and continuing to support natural daylight and indeed ventilation in the projects that you're involved with. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. On a side note, I've got a project I'm going to come and speak to you about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Moving on to the main part of the webinar today. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ian, and then I'll pass it over to him and he'll talk about the project. So Ian Fraser is an associate at LDN Architects and has around 40 years experience. Is that right? I think it must be right, Ian. Ian is a RIAS Advanced accredited conservation architect, and from what I've heard and what I know from experience in Canna House is that he has a deep empathy for older buildings and a genuine curiosity to discover their evolution, stories and character. Ian's approach to conservation is thoughtful and investigative, and he always takes the time to understand what a building needs before he develops the drawings and the final design. So some of his projects include the recently completed Inverness Castle, Inverness Townhouse, the Glen Urquhart Visitor Centre, Fort Augustus Abbey, Knockandow Woolen Mill, and of course Canna House, which we're going to hear about today. So yeah, I suppose I just want to also say from a sort of personal side, I went out to Canna House. I was the only judge that was able to visit because of weather conditions, but I got to spend a good amount of time with Ian and the project manager Glyn, and it was so, their passion for the project was so obvious. And as I'm currently in the role as president of the Highlands Lands, and I am so proud that you're working and living up here, Ian. So thank you for being up here. But I'd like to pass it on to you. Just before actually Ian's slide start, just to say that there's a Q&A. There'll be a Q&A session at the end. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you can't see it, sometimes you have to go into the three dots and more, but it will be there. And so if you've got any questions, just put them in there throughout Ian's presentation and we'll pick it up and talk about those at the end. So, Ian, can I pass it on to you?
Canna House project. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience. So this is a project I've been involved with for roughly 10 years. And so all I can hope to do today is really give you a small snapshot. But this is Canna House, looking quite nice on a spring day. And a quick geography lesson for those of you who don't know where Canna is. It's in the Inner Hebrides. It's an island. It's south of Skye. I hope you can all see that on this map. It's one of the small isles, along with Rum and Muck and Egg. And it's reached by ferry from Mallaig. It's a sort of couple of hours on the ferry. And it's an island which is wholly owned by the National Trust for Scotland. And I'll explain shortly why that is. But this is another view of the house. And in its context, you've got the cliffs of Rum in the far distance and the road running out to the pier before that. It's quite a special setting, as you can see. And this is the reason we're going to talk about it today. It contains an internationally important archive, much of it related to Gaelic culture. And this archive was collected over a lifetime by Margaret Fay Shaw and her husband, John Long Campbell, who owned the island of Canna from 1938, and who on their deaths handed the collection, the house and the island into the safekeeping of the National Trust for Scotland. But they set a condition on this that would have quite a large effect on the project. And this was that the collection remained with the house and on the island. I feel architects like a plan, but I need to apologise for the quality of this plan. But before we start about talking about the house, I just wanted to kind of locate people. So we have the main body of the house with the bay windows and the porch at the bottom left of the plan. And then we have the rear wing extending to the north. This is more servant quarters at the time it was built. You'll see there's at the base of the stair, there's a kind of door leading through to the back of house areas. Obviously the drawing room and the dining room and the like are in the front of the house. And then to the right, there is what was an orangery. It then became the billiard room and estate office on the right. That was a later single-story addition. It has a red roof if you're trying to orientate yourself. But before we talk about the project itself, I'd like to say a few words about the process of conservation. For those who do not know, there's even a British standard for conservation, and this is BS 7913, the Guide to Conservation of Historic Buildings. And this states that the immediate object of building conservation is to secure the protection of the built heritage. So I felt we needed a definition of heritage, particularly in relation to the RIAS and VLUX Architectural Heritage Awards. So according to the Cambridge Dictionary, heritage is the traditions, values and physical objects passed down from past generations. Now, I find the language used in the BS quite difficult, but essentially what it says is conservation is a process that allows change to happen, but only once the significance of the heritage asset, in this case the building, is understood. I think some people think conservation limits change, but I don't think that is the case. I mean, essentially the first stage is to understand the building in its in as much depth as possible through survey and research, and then distill this information down to what is most significant about the building, which is what needs to be safeguarded. And this is used to inform the design at every stage. And this means that every time you make a decision, you should really decide whether that affects the significance. And if so, that should be considered. In our case, we had quite good starting point in terms of defining what was significant about the property, as we were given a conservation plan for the building, which had been commissioned by the National Trust. This set out the history and significance of the house and its contents, and provided the conservation policies that the National Trust wished us to follow. So to understand the house and what comes next, we need to have a quick potted history of the house. If we go back to the early 19th century, the McNeill family initially rented the island from Clan Ranald, who were clan chiefs, and they acted on their behalf and were actively involved in clearing the island of the majority of the tenants to create a sheep farm. And they obviously prospered and were able to buy the island in the and then in the 1860s, they built this new larger house to reflect their new status as owners. And while this house is category B listed, meaning Historic Environment Scotland regarded it to be of regional importance, as you can see, it's relatively modest in scale. And in the 1860s, I think it was probably regarded as quite dated in terms of its design. You know, it's more an early 19th century Georgian house in its appearance than something that's high Victorian. The next owners of Canna were the Tom family, who bought the house in 1880. They were a wealthy Glasgow merchant family, and they represented the new type of Highland laird. You know, they bought the house and the island as a holiday home for pleasure. And because the house was quite young at that stage, the only significant change they made was to add the orangery on the right, the one with the red roof. You know, they have the financial backing of their business empire and were able to invest and improve the island. You know, they built the farm buildings and the pier. And then, as I said before, in 1938, they sold the island to Margaret Fraser and John Lord Campbell, who would make it their home for the next 60 years. Now, unlike the first two owners of the house, we know a lot more about this couple. We have access to Margaret Faishaw's autobiography, which I'd recommend, and John Lord Campbell's island history. And the National Trust have a huge archive within the house. Interestingly, they appear to not have thrown anything away. You know, for example, we have all the correspondence and the receipts from when they sent away for the components necessary to install gas lighting, you know, shortly after the war. And through these sources, we know who came to stay, you know, the likes of the author Compton Mackenzie and the painter Winifred Nicholson, the poet Kathleen Raine. And we also know who they corresponded with. Thus, when we came to develop a brief, or the National Trust came to develop a brief, they had a real understanding of them as people and how the property looked at any particular time. Because we even had articles in kind of fashionable magazines that show us what the house looked like. And we had, you know, a photographic archive of family photos. So, for example, when we came to renew the roof, the failing roof on the orangery, we knew that previously it had a red roof, and, you know, we could replicate that. So if we relate this back to conservation again, in our case, I would argue that the building's significance doesn't lie in its history or its modest architectural quality, despite it being listed. Its importance exists in the people associated with the building and in the house contents, which include rare sound archives and early cine film, both of which are highly flammable when it comes to looking at how to build an archive. And it's this that gives it its cultural and social significance. So here's the brief we were given in 2021: to protect, conserve, interpret and make accessible the interiors, collections and internationally important archive. And the approach was to present Canna House as an occupied family home as it was in the mid-20th century when it was in its heyday. But in contrast, here's the house in 2015 when we first visited it, quite a long way from this heyday. This is 10 years after Margaret Fayshaw died at the age of 101. And I'm sure you can imagine that at that age, building maintenance isn't your most important consideration. So the house was looking quite tired in all respects. It needed maintenance. There was decay. The interiors particularly were quite water damaged, and the services were in very poor condition. So the first thing we did was try to understand the house in detail, room by room, find out what we had. And we soon came up with a list of fabric constraints. Obviously the first couple there we've talked about, so I'll just talk about timber decay briefly. This is one of the first surveys we undertook, and very quickly we realised that the building was in very poor condition, particularly in the rear wings. So if this is the drawings that were provided by the surveyors, and if we zoom in on the kind of rear area, we realise that the partitions were built off a timber floor laid on the bare earth, and the ground was very damp, and therefore both the floor and the partitions were rotten, as were all the lath and the plaster on the west wall, which faced the kind of Atlantic gales. And then looking on the floor above, at first floor, the red line here indicates that virtually all the joist ends were decayed on the west side, plus other problems littered throughout the house. So without jumping ahead too far, this would result in a decision to record the detail and then strip the rear wings back to their stonework. Of course, this recording was important because we still had to put back together the kitchen, which was located in this location, and reinstall all the fittings in that room. So the room, as reconstructed, had to be the same size as the room we took away, with all the same features in the same place. Another fabric constraint we had was the structural deformation that was quite obvious. From this section, some of you may gather that this is a section through the entrance porch and the main staircase running up through the house. And it's quite clear that none of the partitions line up with each other. And this was kind of, these eccentric loads were starting to cause deformation in the floors. And this was manifesting on the ground floor in the form of cracking and bending of the downstands. So one of the first things we did when the job started was to install structural strengthening across these spaces. On the first floor, we were able to prop the floors and cut the joists and insert steelwork within the depth of the floor, so the repair was invisible. But at second floor, we were unable to cut the attic joists as they were part of the roof truss, so we had to create a downstand. So we did our best to sort of disguise this within the final scheme, which you're seeing here. So I kind of move on to design constraints. Obviously, the critical one was how to accommodate an archive and provide it with a stable environment, and actually the fire separation. And particularly if anybody's done an archive, you know, if it's on an upper floor, the required floor loadings are quite onerous. So at an early stage in the project, we had worked with the trust to identify which spaces the public were going to see when they visited Canna House as a tourist attraction. And these are shown on this ground floor plan in yellow, the green spaces being the sort of back of house and private spaces. And as you'll see, you know, these private spaces are mainly in the back wing. And if we do the same exercise on the floor above, we have the yellow spaces at the front of the house, and then these rear, the rear wing, which was of lesser kind of intrinsic value, was an obvious location for an archive. Just while I've got the plan up here, I'll just mention the blue room. This was the room where those items that were too fragile to remove from sight had to remain locked away during the duration of the construction project. So we had, for example, a cabinet of butterflies which couldn't be moved or their wings would all fall off, sitting in the middle in a packing case in the middle of this room throughout the construction site, you know, the duration of the project. But back to the archive and the rear wing, you know, taking into account the condition of the rear wing we've already mentioned, the decision was made to convert this at first floor into an archive. This allowed us to put into a floor construction suitable to take the required loadings, and then we could create a highly insulated thermal box to provide stable environmental conditions and achieve proper fire separation between it and the rest of the house as required. And when we come to look at the plan, and this is a proposed, you know, working plan with the alterations in red, you can see that most of the alterations were within the rear wing and, you know, the billiard room. You know, the approach to the most important rooms were kind of a minimal intervention approach. Going on with design constraints, I'll just quickly touch on excessive travel distance on a single stair. I mean, this is not a domestic house anymore. This is a public building, and obviously we spent a lot of time and worked with a fire engineer to work out how to protect that staircase and upgrade the doors and allow escape, and also protect the archive from a fire in the house, and vice versa, because the archive contained flammable materials. Further design constraints, the need to reduce the fire risk in the house as far as possible. This is a survey photograph we have, which shows quite a lot of flammable materials stacked around the original boiler. You know, we wanted to, this is an island with a population of under 20 and no standing fire brigade, you know, 2 hours from the mainland. If there's a fire, all they can do is get out. You know, there's no way to fight a fire. Therefore, we wanted to avoid that fire by removing the risk from the house. So this kind of aerial view of the walled garden, there's a small amount of land on the left-hand side you'll see there. This originally contained the diesel generator shed. But we decided to build a new plant room in that location, a timber-clad plant room. It was we put the battery storage in there, we put all the heating equipment in there, and we connected it by flow and return pipe work, insulated, running under the wall, through the tree roots and across the lawn into the house. And we did our best to try and disguise this intervention outside the garden wall. You know, we looked at it from various angles and tried to keep its profile as low as possible. And in this photo, you can just see it sort of peeking out over the top of the rise in the field below the trees. So that's it in its final form. And then finally, another design constraint was the poor accessibility on the island. You know, it's got no paved roads, no level access. It's not very wheelchair friendly. But we were keen that if somebody did make the effort and made it to the house, that there would still be access, despite there being 4 steps at the front door. So we altered the ground levels in as far as possible we could to bring them into the house on a level, so they have access to the whole of the ground floor. I mean, we did consider lifts, but it was decided that that was too much of an intervention in terms of the heritage impact. So briefly, site constraints. This is an island with very little vehicular access. That the house wasn't designed to, you know, it was only designed to get a horse and cart to it. You know, so as soon as you have a contractor who needs to get a scaffolding lorry up to the house, you have problems. So we had to widen the whole drive. That's number 2 on this plan. We widened it at the very beginning of the job and then reduced its width again and put it back the way it was at the end. We also, in a mature garden, wanted to limit the damage to the garden itself. And therefore, we closely defined which parts of the garden the contractor had access to throughout the job. And it was all taped off, so they couldn't deviate from that. Bats were a huge issue in this house. This rear wing, that there was a bat roost across much of the rear wing, and this had profound implications for the contractor. This is just a snapshot. This is phase 4. This is the summer before completion, just when the the site is at its busiest, and technically the contractor only had access to the ground floor of the house during this time to avoid disturbance to the bats. So the constraints put on the contractor were quite onerous. And then finally, we had a lack of accommodation for the contractor on the island. You know, I've said it's an island with a permanent population of under 20. It's remote, it has poor transport links, and we had nowhere on the island to store the contents of the house during the works. And I mentioned that earlier, that the contents had to remain on the island as part of the bequest. So our solution to this was to build a compound, a workers' village on the island near the pier. And this contained 8 climate control containers for the contents of the house, and it had offices for the National Trust. It had the contractors' offices and compound, and it had accommodation modules for use by the workers there, the subcontractors who came to the island, the consultants who visited, and also the kind of specialists who attended site. So this was all began to happen in 2022. We started to mobilize and the house took 6 months to pack up. Here's the sitting room with the wallpapers removed in preparation for the work. And then work actually commenced in 2023. And the first thing we had to address was the weather. This is us putting a scaffold up to put a temporary roof on so that we could open the house up at the front behind the parapet to remove the rot from below the lead parapet gutters. I've only got a few. I don't have time to talk about all the conservation challenges, so I'm going to highlight just a few at the end of this talk, really. The first was wallpaper. Much of this, or quite a lot of this, dated from the 1860s and was regarded as quite important. Quite a lot of it had been damaged in the past and ruined by water. And as you can imagine, trying to rewire and service a house and undertake structural repairs while preserving the wallpapers was quite a challenge. So some of them were protected for the duration of the projects, and others were removed, as I mentioned earlier. And then others still were replicated and used to patch the existing damaged wallpapers. I'll just mention plasterwork purely because this was an example where specialists employed directly by the National Trust and the contractor's own plasterers worked side by side to try and address the extent of the damage to the existing plaster, depending on their capabilities. And then another aspect of this project was the need for colour matching. We tried our very best to keep as many of the existing decorative finishes, the original decorative finishes, untouched. An example is the beams we were looking at earlier, where the Trust was keen to retain the nicotine staining on the ceiling. Margaret Fay Shaw was a famous smoker right until her death, and yet we still had to repair these beams, patch these beams, repair the cracks, replace missing decorative plasterwork, and then specialists were brought in to touch these up so that you couldn't tell that the nicotine staining had been disturbed. There are many aspects of this project. I just don't have time to talk about them, but obviously there's an interpretation component. And then there was the actual conservation of all the furniture and fittings and things within the rooms, which were brought back into the house at the end of the job. And then, photographic evidence was used to reassemble them in a kind of accurate representation of how the house was in the past. So if I kind of draw this to a conclusion now, yeah, you may know the expression from the Borough Charter, do as much as necessary and as little as possible. The Borough Charter, it codified international conservation when it was drafted in 1979. And at the heart of this charter are these core principles, for example, minimal intervention. And we tried to follow these when we were doing the work. So, for example, at the first stage, we protected anything that could remain in the house to avoid accidental damage. And then we wanted to respect all periods of the house's development. And so we resisted the urge to tidy contradictions of kind of multiple changes in sanitary ware, for example. It would be very easy to have tidied that up and put in a matching suite of sanitary ware, that, that wasn't appropriate. When reversibility was important, when building control insisted on a barrier and a handrail in the attic, we built it in such a way that it was reversible. It could be removed at any time. And obviously, in the rear wing, when it became obvious that the existing fabric had to come away, it was decided that this intervention would remain as a legibly new piece of work. It's an honest space. We didn't tidy it up in any way. But wherever possible, the approach was one of minimal intervention, so that the maximum amount of original fabric was retained. So tying this back to conservation theory, if you can bear it, if conservation is all the processes of looking after a place so as to retain its cultural significance, and this could include maintenance and may, according to circumstances, include preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and adaptation. I'm just asking what you think we've actually been doing here. If the approach was to present Canna House as an occupied home in the mid-20th century, we've obviously done more than preserve the house in its original state or its existing state. We've done more than removing accretions, so it's not restoration. Is it reconstruction, returning a place to as nearly as possible a known earlier state? I would argue that we knew enough to not make it conjectural, so it wasn't recreation. But at the end of the day, I suspect it was probably modifying a place to suit a proposed compatible use. We took a domestic house and turned it into a public visitor centre. I think that's probably the classification that works best under the Borough Charter. Anyway, at this stage, I just want to acknowledge the other consultants on the project, Simpson Builders, who were fundamental to its success, and of course the National Trust, both as client and specialists who made a lot of this possible. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions if that's appropriate.
Thank you, Ian. That was so good. You brought me back right to the experience of the building. So thank you. And you did well to get through everything.
Well, I was starting to worry at the beginning.
I was ready. I was ready to lock into a 3-hour epic, but it's okay. We can save that for another evening. But I've got I can't see any questions in the Q&A. So if anyone is here and has got questions, please put them in there. But I have a couple of questions myself. I've got more generic questions, but I kind of want to dive in with a couple just from notes that I'd taken from your talk. So the first one was you kind of began talking about the house and the rear of the building, and you'd had a survey done of the existing condition, and it just so much of it looked in poor condition. But I was quite interested to know, which is a selfish question because I'm working on a project on another island in the Hebrides, which your answer might affect what I do. But I was wondering what the construction of the existing walls were and what your solution was for dealing with the moisture in it.
I mean, they were solid stone construction, but
do you know what the stone is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the problem. I mean, it was mainly quarried locally.
Yeah.
The thing that was brought in were the dressings, and it's the whole island is igneous based. It's volcanic, and I think the way it had been dressed did result in water running into the walls. So I don't know how we solved it. I think it just needed, it needed to be properly pointed. It needed the roof to be sound. I mean, I don't think it was rocket science in terms of keeping the water out.
No, that was okay, just in case there was anything magic that you did.
No.
And my this
We,
I don't
we,
know,
we
maybe
didn't
this
put
is a
solvent sealants on it or anything.
no, good, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And my there's a question here actually, so I'll jump in with that one. So from a Nick Brown, it says, "Hi Ian, can you perhaps say a bit more about your relationship with Simpson Builders and National Trust Scotland and the importance of that relationship in achieving the goals of the project?"
Golly. Well, I mean, there was a big team. I mean, I'm presenting the whole project, but uh, it was I was really just handling the architectural side of it. I mean, the project manager had more balls in the air. There was the interpretation team and the IT team and all the specialists who were brought in, the wallpaper, the carpet, all these people who were involved in the project and all contributed to it. But we couldn't program wise, we couldn't just finish the architecture section and hand it over for a fit out. There had to be some overlap because of the specialisms involved. So to answer Nick's question, it's that working relationship. It was a contractor who was prepared to go that extra mile and work, invite or accept that all these other specialists would be working at the same time as them on site, and they would all be um, contributing to the project and working side by side to achieve this, which is quite special. I don't think all contractors would do that. So
No, I
no,
don't think so.
that's why
It's
I want to really
patience
say,
and I think understanding, I suppose everybody the feeling that I got when I was there that everyone understood, all parties understood what the goal of the project was.
I
So
think
everyone's
so.
like working towards that.
Yeah, and we had, what there's so many aspects I haven't really talked about, but the fact that you have an island with a small winter population of sort of 15 and you bring 30 contractors on site, I mean, it's that relationship was key, that they took the population with them. Um, and part of that was it was a Highland contractor, and the staff were local and they came from the same thing, they brought their fiddles and their bagpipes and you know, became part of the community over those winters when the ferries weren't running.
That sounds like a good tender
I think
introduction.
I think that had a lot to do with the success of the project and the acceptance of the contractor and the way the project proceeded.
Yeah. No, I was also interested how you manage the site visits yourself and how many
Yes,
you did.
from your experience, you know that the ferry
It's
doesn't
not the
always go.
easiest place to get to, is it?
It wasn't. There was more than one occasion when we, got as far as Malé and discovered that they weren't going to run the ferry because they'd
Hmm.
cancelled it since we left home. Because that's 2 hours away to start with.
Hmm.
So, and there were times we couldn't get the ferry off again. Um, so there was a lot of flexibility, and to be honest, it's the sort of job which some practices would possibly not want to take on just because of the uncertainty. The partner at the time, Peter McElhenney, was seemed to have a um, predilection for taking on jobs in remote locations, which I don't know how they made money, to be honest. But
Greater good.
uh, you know, the love of the job was more important than the thing. So yes, you would go for you'd have to go the day before, and you wouldn't get home till 10 o'clock at night. It was quite an onerous site visit on a quite regular basis for most of 2 years.
That's a big commitment. And from like the whole team as well. I imagine also the contractors going off on an island, going back home or
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean the contractors, they stayed for sort of 10 days and they went home for 3 days or something. You know, 9 days on, 3 days off, or something like that.
Yeah.
Weeks, which is a big ask as well. And not it became clear that not all staff could cope with that as well. So that there was the contractor, Simpsons, then you know chose the staff who were interested in doing the work.
Gosh, it's, hearing about all the different aspects, you've got the architecture, you've got the structural side, you've got the practicalities, you've got the client, I don't know, just everyone involved. It was such an effort, and the outcome is
I
so
think
special.
once you committed to it, you
Yeah,
really,
you're in it.
yes, you just had to go with it. Um, there was no backing out really.
Yeah. So I've got two more questions for you. Have you got any juicy bits of gossip from the time?
You should have prepped me for that one.
Sorry.
Should have
You can
shown
come back to it. You can come back. And my other question is a bit more sensible is you're extremely experienced conservation architect, and I know that you like discovering the history and the stories of a building. Do you think you've developed your own way of approaching any project in throughout from your career, or do you think the way that you approach every project, conservation projects, has to be different?
I think they do, and it to a certain extent depends on the client, and I mean, if you're working with Historic Scotland or the National Trust or something, they expect a different approach, I suspect, from working on a listed building in a more commercial atmosphere. So I don't think you try to, but you can't. Maybe you can't overtly apply the same approach in every case. Um, you know, some of them are very commercial, large housing jobs. The conversion of Fort Augustus Abbey was far from this sort of approach. But you
I
want
suppose Canna, you've got such a big archive and amount of information
yes,
already to go
you
through.
do.
So
But actually, um, being presented with it as actually having to go and find it yourself, if potentially you become more invested in that detail.
mhm.
Um,
I've got two more questions and then maybe we'll tie things
sorry,
up. So I've got one from Nick Brown. He said, "How did you, the client, and the contractor resolve insurance responsibility, given that the content items had to stay in the house during the works?" That's a good technical question.
sorry. Um, that was more a project management issue. I mean, um, I I mean, not all the contents remained in the house. Only the most fragile remained in the house. But yes, um, there were clearly issues that more of value remained in the house.
I think I remember talking to
You
the project
don't
manager
experience
about
that.
this.
Yeah. Well, you tell
And
me what you think the answer is then.
no, I just remember I don't know what the actual legal agreements were, but it just seemed that not just in relation to the contents in the archive, but it was just everyone, all the parties involved seemed to take a practical approach to something. So like, yes, elements of the archive had to stay in the house, which wasn't ideal, but then it's just balancing what's realistically possible, what could realistically happen. And yeah, so risk assessment, I suppose, was so important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was those matters are really formalized. As you
Hmm.
said, I think when it became clear that these things had to stay on site, I think it was the most practical solution was taken to them, just as you
Yeah,
said.
level minds. And I've got one final question, which um, it's from Rosemary, and she was asking about the budget, but I know that the budget's confidential because that's something to do with National Trust. But I don't know if there's something you can just say generally about anything to do with the cost of the project.
Yeah, I mean, the architecture was um, only one part of it, and that's the figures I know. I mean, clearly there was um, a lot of specialisms, and I don't know what the conservation of all those contents were, but there have been hundreds and hundreds of man hours um, involved in these matters. Um, so, but what I do know is that well, I believe the National Trust Trust for Scotland were content that the budget came in where they expected to be, which is considering the complications and the fact that ferries wouldn't go, and the contractor had all sorts of difficulties in that respect. The fact that it could come in on budget was quite gratifying, really.
It's exceptional. No, that's a good job. Is there anything you'd like to say to finish things off, or are you ready to?
Oh, I don't think I'm ready to have a drink. Of course, I started this without a glass of water, which I realised very quickly was a very foolish mistake.
No, not at all. But no, thank you so much. It's also nice to speak to you again about the project and hear about it. I was blown away. And if anyone, I hope some people have maybe been to see the house themselves, but if they haven't, please go. It is so special. Go stay at the B&B, stay in the campsite, support the island culture, go and see this amazing piece of architecture that Ian has been part of. So thank you so much, Ian.
Yeah. You
Um,
book online, and I think you can. In the summer, the ferries go in the. You can go there and back in the day.
you can. Hmm.
But it would be much better to stay. It's quite a special place.
Yeah.
The evening when it's quiet and there's only a few people on the island. Yeah.
Oh, I'm jealous that you got to experience all of that.
Well, yeah, it was really quite a highlight of the work I've done.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That concludes today's session. So thanks, Ian, for giving up your time and getting the slides sorted as well. I know how challenging these things are. And thank you to everyone for coming along. The recording is going to be up on YouTube shortly. So yeah, have a look there if you want to go back through any of the points, and join us next week, next Wednesday lunchtime, for the final detail webinar of 2026, which is with James Lowe from Studio Octopi. And he's going to be talking about the Tarlair Outdoor Pools Pavilion, which won the RIAS Gilmore Aitken Client of the Year award. So yeah, we hope, well, I like watching these sessions. It's really helpful to have them online. So I hope everyone else is enjoying them as much as I am. And it's good to have them as an archive, I suppose, for the future. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for listening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.